Melania Trump sued Jasmine Crockett. Nobody expected the trial to spiral into a public reckoning until one witness revealed the truth that changed everything in less than 10 seconds. The moment the headline broke, it felt like the ground shook under Washington's feet. First Lady Melania Trump sues Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett for defamation. It wasn't rumor. It wasn't speculation. It was a real legal filing with Melania Trump's name stamped at the top. For many Americans, the question wasn't if this would spark a storm. It was how big the storm would get. Think about it. A first lady, someone who has usually remained quiet in the political brawls, decided to drag a rising Democratic star into court. That alone was enough to guarantee cameras outside the courthouse, reporters swarming, and cable networks filling airtime with endless speculation. But what really made people's jaws drop was the idea that this case wasn't about policy or power struggles in Congress. It was about words Jasmine Crockett had spoken, sharp and direct, that Melania's team claimed had crossed the line into defamation. And in today's world, where every sentence can be clipped, tweeted, replayed, and dissected, the stakes couldn't have been higher. The courthouse in Dallas was where it all began. Early morning, the air sticky with Texas heat, yet that didn't stop the crowd. Protesters with homemade signs stood shoulder to shoulder with Trump supporters draped in flags. Reporters leaned over barricades shouting questions at anyone in a suit who walked by. A local woman standing on the corner with a cup of iced coffee whispered to a friend, "This feels bigger than a trial. It feels like history." Inside, the atmosphere was heavy. Wooden benches filled with journalists, legal experts, and curious citizens who managed to squeeze in. At the front, two women whose lives couldn't be more different. Melania, elegant and reserved, every movement measured. Crockett, fiery and unapologetic, with a gaze that dared anyone to silence her. "Mrs. Trump versus Representative Crockett," the clerk called out. The words rang through the room, and in that moment, every eye turned forward. This wasn't just another lawsuit. It was a clash of legacies. To understand why this mattered so much, you need to know who Jasmine Crockett is. She isn't the type to tiptoe around controversy. A freshman congresswoman from Texas, she built her reputation on bold statements, grilling opponents, and speaking for communities often ignored in political halls. She doesn't whisper. She projects. That's part of why she gained so much attention so quickly. And it's also why someone as insulated as Melania Trump would take the risk of facing her head-on in court. But lawsuits are never simple. Melania's team insisted that Crockett's remarks weren't just political banter. They claimed she suggested things about Melania's involvement in financial dealings, suggestions that carried implications damaging enough to trigger this legal showdown. To Melania's supporters, this was about protecting dignity and drawing a line. To Crockett's backers, it looked like an attempt to muzzle a voice that had rattled the White House. Cameras clicked furiously as the lawyers walked in. Reporters scribbled notes as fast as their hands could move. Every detail mattered. What color Melania's dress was, the expression on Crockett's face, even the way each woman adjusted her posture. Because everyone knew this case was about more than just the courtroom. It was about image, perception, and narrative. Crockett leaned toward her attorney and whispered something, earning a small nod in return. Melania didn't flinch, her expression unreadable, but she clutched her pen tightly against her folder. These two women weren't just separated by ideology. They were separated by approach. Melania, carefully curated, a portrait of silence, turned to speech only when necessary. Crockett, loud and unafraid, her very presence a challenge to the structure of power. The first few minutes of that morning made one thing clear. No matter the outcome, this trial would not leave either woman untouched. Reputations would be tested, secrets would be hinted at, and the whole nation would be watching, waiting for the spark that could ignite something larger than both of them. Outside, chants rose louder. Some shouted support for Melania, calling Crockett reckless. Others cheered for Jasmine, praising her courage to stand up even when the odds seemed stacked. Police lined the steps to keep the tension from boiling over. But inside, in that wooden courtroom where history had already started to write itself, the silence between arguments was louder than the shouting outside. Everyone sensed it. This wasn't just about a lawsuit. This was about truth versus perception, courage versus control, and the dangerous gamble of dragging words into a courtroom. But before the first argument was even made, people already wondered who would come out of this trial standing taller and who would leave with their legacy cracked beyond repair. If you're going to understand why this lawsuit exploded the way it did, you need to know who Jasmine Crockett really is. Not the headlines, not the talking points, but the story behind the firebrand voice that landed her in that courtroom across from Melania Trump. Jasmine Crockett didn't rise through the political ranks quietly. Before she ever stood in Congress, she built her name in Dallas courtrooms, defending people who didn't have the money or connections to protect themselves. She was the attorney who would take the late-night calls from a worried mother whose son was arrested, or a father who feared losing his job over a misunderstanding. People in those neighborhoods didn't just know Jasmine as a lawyer. They knew her as someone who cared enough to fight. Jasmine never walked away from a hard case, recalled Andre Phillips, a local activist who had worked with her years earlier. She wasn't scared of judges, prosecutors, or anybody else. She believed in looking people in the eye and telling the truth, even if it wasn't pretty. That blunt honesty, sharp enough to sting, fearless enough to ruffle feathers, was what carried her from local politics all the way to Washington. She didn't polish her words for comfort. She sharpened them for impact. And it worked. When Jasmine won her congressional seat, critics thought she'd eventually mellow out, learn to play the game like so many others do once they land in D.C. But she didn't. If anything, her voice only grew louder. On committee floors, in press interviews, and across social media, Crockett became known for clapping back when someone tried to cut her off or minimize her point. She wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for every person who had told her, "We don't have a voice up there." That defiance of political etiquette made her a target. Lobbyists didn't like her. Career politicians rolled their eyes when she walked in. Conservative media painted her as reckless, while progressives saw her as a breath of fresh air. And through it all, Jasmine seemed unfazed. So when she made comments that touched on Melania Trump's role during certain Trump-era dealings, nobody was surprised by the boldness of her words, but people were surprised by the response. Instead of ignoring her, brushing it off as political theater, Melania took action. "Why her?" one reporter asked on a morning talk show. "Why Jasmine? Out of all the critics the Trump family has faced, why single out this Congresswoman?" That question lingered, because Jasmine wasn't the most famous name in Congress, nor the most powerful. She didn't chair a committee. She wasn't running for president. Yet somehow, she had struck a nerve deep enough that the First Lady of the United States decided to take her to court. Part of it was Crockett's fearlessness. She wasn't someone you could intimidate into silence. Threats of lawsuits didn't push her off balance. If anything, they fueled her. And that was dangerous for someone like Melania, who had built her public image on control, elegance, and careful distance from controversy. Jasmine was her opposite, raw, blunt, and unwilling to apologize. And then there was the symbolism. For millions of people watching, this wasn't just a legal battle between two women. It was a collision of two very different Americas. On one side, a congresswoman who came from modest beginnings, fought her way through law school, and built her platform on being unfiltered. On the other, a first lady with global recognition, a name associated with wealth, power, and a carefully cultivated image. When the lawsuit was filed, Jasmine didn't back down. In fact, she leaned in harder. Standing outside her district office in Dallas, she told reporters, "If speaking the truth about power lands me in court, then that's exactly where I'm supposed to be. I don't run, I don't hide." Those words played on loop across networks. Supporters cheered her bravery. Critics called it arrogance. But everyone agreed on one thing. Jasmine Crockett wasn't scared. That was the key. Fearlessness. It's what made her dangerous in politics. It's what made her compelling to her supporters. And it's what made this lawsuit more than just legal paperwork. It became a test of whether someone who had always spoken truth to power could survive a direct strike from one of the most powerful figures in the country. Her staff, though, saw the strain behind the bold words. Late nights in her office, stacks of legal files on her desk, Jasmine sometimes rubbed her temples, knowing what was at stake. "They want to break me," she admitted to one aide. "But if I bend now, I'll never be able to stand up again." The lawsuit wasn't just about clearing her name. For Jasmine, it was about survival, not just politically, but personally. If she lost, she risked being branded reckless forever. If she won, she'd prove that even the highest office in the land couldn't silence her. But while Jasmine's defiance made headlines, the bigger question remained. What drove Melania to risk everything by taking her to court in the first place? For years, Melania Trump built a reputation on silence. While her husband commanded headlines and courted controversy, she stayed mostly in the background. Her words were rare, her appearances calculated, her image carefully controlled. That's why when news broke that she had